It's not even 11 o'clock. My brain's already fried. So now that you have a better idea of how to shoot these photos, next thing you're going to want to do is learn how to edit. So the only two things you're going to need are Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop. And to be honest, you don't even really need Photoshop right off the bat. That will come. I'm going to teach you how to do basic stuff in this video, but Lightroom is really all you're going to need to really make the adjustments and practice right off the bat. So I think the photography package is like $14 a month, which is like a meal at McDonald's, you know? So I don't want to hear I can't afford it. Get it? It's worth it. It's $14 a month, maybe 20. Like, I don't know. It's not much. It's an absolute necessity for this career choice, for this hobby, whatever you want to do, you need Lightroom. I use Lightroom Classic. So there's a difference. There's Lightroom and there's Lightroom Classic. I don't know the first thing about Lightroom. I just use Lightroom Classic. It has everything you need. It's very simply laid out. It's basic. And that's what I'm going to teach you how to use. So this is what I've been using for over 10 years. If you want to download Lightroom and, go that route, you do you. There's plenty of videos online on how to use it. I don't know how to use it. I'm going to teach you how to use Lightroom Classic. Okay. So LRC, this is the logo that it looks, LRC. And then there's Lightroom, that's just LR, obviously. This is a shot that you should be able to take at this point. So I shot this at 70 mil. Obviously I was fully zoomed in here. 2.8 aperture. So the subject here is in focus, whereas the background and the foreground are slightly out of focus, right? I used the framing, so I lined up this wall to kind of keep it all together, and the foreground to add a little bit more, just take away from some dead space here. So the majority of my work, unless it's client work, will be going on Instagram. So first thing I do when I get a photo that I want to edit in Lightroom is I frame it. I crop it properly for Instagram, which is Instagram. You can obviously do landscape, so wide shots, portrait shots. But because the majority of my work goes on social media, I mostly shoot vertical. There are some like hero shots that I'll shoot landscape if my client wants prints, or if I think it would be a good print to sell down the line. Great for computer wallpapers, that kind of stuff. You want to shoot horizontal, but for social media, it's better if you shoot vertical. You'll know what you're working with a lot better. So anyway, this is what Lightroom is going to look like. So when you first download Lightroom, there's going to be all of these options are going to be up here, right? So you get map, book, slideshow, so all that stuff. I only ever use library and develop. So you go here, you just right click and you can get rid of all these unless you want to use them. I've literally never used them and I've built a career off this, so they're not as important. You can size photos for print in Photoshop much easier, I think. Like I said, I've never used those, but I can look into that if one of you guys want to learn. When you first come in, you're going to go to library. Okay. And this is obviously your library, right? I see all my photographs in here. So I got 36,000, which is not that much. It sounds like a lot, but between all my catalogs and libraries and my home computer, my work computer, I probably have about 1 million photos. And that's not an exaggeration either. This is where everything is going to be. This is like the home base. You go through all your photo shoots here, right? Everything is here. So to get photos in here, what you want to do, you go here, import. So then this little window is going to pop up. Now, this is where the photos are coming from. So it'd be your memory card. This is where you're saving them to. So I got a memory card in there. Should pop up here any second. So there it is. That's my memory card. So I'll click this little arrow. This is like everything on the card. This breaks it down into folders. So my photos are in this folder and then this subfolder. Sony does things very, very odd. So anyway, obviously these are all the photos that are on the card, right? So anything, now it blanks it out like this because they're already uploaded, but you saw the check marks earlier. There'll be check marks in the top left of each photo. So I obviously imported all of these. So you can just click all photos and it highlights all of them, okay? Now, this is where you're going to save it to. I would recommend getting a SSD or like an external drive or something like that to save the photos to, because I made that mistake when I first started. Raw photos are huge. You want to save the photos to an external drive, ideally. Otherwise, it's going to bog your computer down. I only have 1 terabyte of memory on this computer, and it sounds like a lot, but when you get a bunch of raw photos on here, that gets eaten up real quick. And then your editing workflow takes forever because your computer is constantly loading. So now that you know how to upload here, you know how to choose your photos, you're going to come over here, and this little arrow, you click down, right? And these are all different destinations, but you can choose other destination. And then here, like I would choose my SSD, and then I would save it on here, the car and the owner's name. And then you could create new folder. So that's where I create the raw folder, and then I would save it in there. And then these folders are just part of the memory, and then all of them are in there, right? So that saves all of them to my SSD. And then you would hit import right down here, and then you wait for all of them to import. Okay. Now all of the photos are imported. They're in your library. They're organized. You can start editing. Okay, so then we go over, actually I'm going to find that picture I wanted to show you guys how to edit. So this one. So then you click develop. Okay, and that's going to bring you here. And then you have all of these tools here. Okay, so like I said, the first thing we should do is crop it depending on where you're posting it, so you know what you're working with. So 4x5 is Instagram's. That's the way to get the most real estate on an Instagram feed, right? So I'll show you an example here. Click on one of the photos. Also go follow me, by the way, if you're not. So this is a 4x5. You get 5 high, 4 wide. That allows you to get the most amount of real estate possible on the page. Whereas if you have a square, you still could have a higher photo. And it just, like when you're scrolling through your feed, these 4x5 photos are going to take up pretty much your whole screen. So that's what you want to frame them as. So do that. You go to the corner here, you'll see this little angled arrow. So that allows you to turn it. And then you can also crop in and see this little lock. Make sure that's locked, because if it's open, it's just going to do this. And then your 4x5 isn't 4x5 anymore, right? So keep that locked. Now I want us to level this. So I'm going to take the bottom of the car and make sure it lines up with these lines as best it can. And this all depends on how you've shot the photo. Sometimes if it's off kilter, or like, don't always rely on those lines to be lined up with the part of the car. Just set it as best you can, hit enter, and then look at the image and just use your own judgment to make sure it's straight. Or if you don't want a straight image, make it crooked. Do whatever you want to do. That's where the creative style comes in, right? This is all your basic settings, right? Oh, it literally says basic there. So it's your white balance. So like we talked about earlier, you can have really warm images, or you can have really cool images, right? And that just depends on your creative style once again. So this whole section, I'm just going to teach you how this works. There's no right or wrong way to do this when it comes to the creative styles. That's up to you, finding your own style. I'm just going to show you what I do. And if you like it, you can emulate it. And over time, you're going to make your own tweaks based on that base assumption and base knowledge of how this works to create your own style, right? That's what we all do. Now let's just say, oh it's way too warm. How do I go back to where it was at the beginning? Any of these words, you just double click and it'll go right back to where it was when you uploaded it. This eyedropper is an auto white balance corrector. So if you click on that, you find a neutral spot in the image. So either a gray, a white, or a black. Now for this example, I'm just going to use the concrete. Usually this is a pretty good baseline. So you click on that, boom. So that's a little bit of an auto white balance. Now for a shot like this though, I want it to be a little warmer because clearly it's super bright out. I want this to be a warmer shot. So I'm just going to slightly warm that up. I think that looks better. Okay, now the ground I'm looking at is a little overexposed. So the first thing here, you get exposure. Now, keep in mind, these affect everything in the photo. So if I turn down the exposure on the ground, so see the ground is exposed properly now, but now the cars are super dark. So if you double click this, reset it, you can go down to highlights. So these are obviously the highlights in the image. You can bring that down and it'll bring the highlights down without really affecting the cars too much. We'll just leave that somewhere in the middle there. Now, so, I'm not going to edit this whole photo. I'm going to go through and show you what each of these do. And then I'll edit the photo for a separate video. And I'll also add that in so you can see how I would edit it with understanding how all of this stuff works, right? Now, contrast is obviously contrast, the difference between the highlights and the shadows, or the blacks and the whites, however you want to say it. So, you turn this up, you're going to get a sharper, like, darker darks and lighter lights, versus lower contrast, you're going to have less of a separation between those two, right? See, now the highlights aren't as big of a difference between the contrast, and so on. Actually, it's pretty dope. I'm going to use that in the future. Anyway, you play around with that. I like the contrast how it is, so we're just going to leave it. Shadows obviously are the shadows. I want to bring out a little bit of the detail in some of these shadows, so I'm just going to slightly raise those. And the whites and blacks are pretty damn self-explanatory, very similar to highlights and shadows. It's more, I don't know, it's just it hits the colors and the shadows and highlights a little differently than the shadows and highlights section. So I don't normally touch those. I'll bring the blacks down sometimes as opposed to turning up the contrast. You'll see why over the course of time. Texture, clarity, and dehaze. So texture does just that. Like, it'll just add texture. So we'll go all the way over and you can see it adds a little bit more grit to the image. You see what I mean? Like, the image just seems grittier. Whereas if I take this down, it's going to look really soft. See, like, that's stupid. No one wants that. Unless that's a style you're looking for, you don't really ever have to do negative texture. I don't see a point of it. Clarity, it's similar to texture. It just like, I don't know, it's like an artificial clarity. These are just the extreme sides of it. I don't normally ever play with the clarity on the overall image. You'll see why in a second. And then dehaze. So dehaze, if there's haze in the image, it brings it down and it sharpens it a bit. Whereas negative dehaze, it makes it softer, it brightens it up. So you see what I mean? So you can get like a super soft image if you turn all these down. And obviously this is the extreme. This is ridiculous. You'd never edit a photo like this. I mean, you could, but it looks kind of weird. Whereas if I bring all these up, you're going to get like a really like saturated, over the top, like sharp photo, right? So if you want to reset all of these, instead of clicking on all these individually, you just click the title and that resets the whole section. Now, vibrance and saturation do exactly what you think they do. Vibrance is the vibrance of a color, or the vibrance of the image, so it'll bring up everything. The colors will be very vibrant and they'll pop a lot more, like that. Saturation, you can oversaturate, so it's like almost like brings the colors, it just like turns the volume of the colors up, if that makes sense. Down here, you get the tone curves. So these are going to be the highlights up here, and these are going to be the shadows, right? So I can bring the highlights down, and I can bring the shadows up. And you can do everything in between. And you can create points. So something that is very popular is called an S curve. So you click, and that stays there. So now I can adjust this with this curve or this point staying in the same place. And I don't normally do this, but it is something that I know a lot of people do. I just find it looks cheap. It doesn't really hit the image that I want to do. But like I said, I'm teaching you how to use these tools. You do what you want to do to create your vision. Now I'm just going to reset these. And in here you can affect the reds, the teals, the greens, the magentas, the blues, and the yellows. But I like to leave it here. We'll play with those. Like up here, you can play with those. You don't really need them in the curves, but you have the option to if you'd like. Color mixer. Usually this will start off with like one of these. So just click all and you'll get the hue, the saturation, and the luminance. So these can really change the whole feel of an image. So the hue will change the colors. You see how the colors change on here? So let's take the blues, for example, right? So if I were to drag this over here, you see this is purple and this is baby blue. So this will affect the blues in the image. So if I bring this all the way over, this car and this one are going to be more purple, right? That's pretty damn cool, actually. I like that. But if you bring them over the other way, they're going to be baby blue. And that goes, or even teal. So that goes for every color, right? But then you just double click, reset. And that's where you can get really creative. If you want to go over the top and start changing colors of cars, you can do that. Now, Another thing, if you don't know what color it is that you want to adjust, this little circle here, if you click on that, it'll bring up this. So let's say I want to change whatever this is. Is it red? Is it orange? I can't tell. So you click and hold, and then you can drag up and down. And you see on the side there, they're changing, but I'm not changing them. So every color that it finds within that color range will change. Okay? So that's just an easier way of doing it, and with saving you from going through the oranges, adjusting them, the reds, adjusting them, and then you can just kind of do that, right? So that's hue. Hue is going to change the color of colors. Saturation, you guessed it, it's going to change the saturation. So blue here, we'll do a fully saturated blue. It's going to be way too blue. Like, you really see the blues even in the windows pop, and it's just too much. Whereas you bring them down, it's going to basically be gray. If there's no blues, like, that is gangster. I like that a lot, actually. So we'll do that, and then I could even bring down the oranges and the reds, and the whole car is just going to be gray, which looks kind of weird. But if I just bring the reds back, you'll kind of see that. And then the oranges will come back. You'll see it pop even more. And then the blue, right? So that's saturation. Pretty simple. Play around with it. Get weird. Luminance is the brightness of a color. Here you can kind of see what it's going to do. So it's going to take like a thicker chunky blue and make it whiter, right? It's kind of weird. I don't use luminance a lot. And then here it's going to make it darker, right? It just like dulls the color. It's a very strange thing, but it has its purpose when colors are too bright. You know what I mean? So like, let's just say this was a little too bright for your liking. You could bring down the luminance a bit on the orange and the reds, and you'll see it'll dull it down. See? So it's the luminance. It's like the brightness of a color. Assuming you have the newest version of Lightroom, there's this thing called point color. So it's kind of all of these mixed into one. So you click point color, comes over here. You grab this little paint dropper and you pick a color. So let's pick blue. We'll click it. And then now this comes up, right? So this is the color that I clicked on. So that's what it chose. This here is going to be the saturation or the luminance of the blue, right? So you can adjust it here. And then here you get the hue. So you can move this around if you want it more purple. Like, you get to pick the color that you want the color to be, right? And you go over purple. And then here you can kind of change the saturation and the hue, the luminance down here. The nice thing about this is you don't have to just choose one, right? If I wanted to choose the blues, I can click this again and I'll go pick the reds, and it creates another one here, right? So then I can go and change this. I can turn that down, right? So you can get really weird and creative with this. It's just fun to play around with. And then you right click and you go delete this swatch or delete all swatches. So these are swatches. We're just going to delete them all because obviously I want to keep this as natural looking as possible. So that's the color mixer. You'll have a lot of fun in that one. I really enjoy it. Color grading is similar but different. So this takes the overall image, and we got midtones, shadows, and highlights, which also you can choose here. So you get shadows, midtones, highlights. So I'm going to start with the shadows, and here you can introduce colors into them, right? So if I want the shadows to be more blue, you'll see it in the walls, in here, in the rims. So I'll bring it down to really hit that point home. So yeah, see the wall's very blue now, versus if I bring it up here, it's going to be very yellow or green or, you know, purple or whatever color you want. If you ever seen like the teal and orange look, this is where that comes from. So you get like a little bit of teal in the shadows. You go over to the highlights and you get a little bit of oranges in there, and it gives it that look. Some people like it, some people hate it. It just depends on your creative style, but that's how you use the color grading. And this can really affect the overall vibe of an image. Like, I'll show you a perfect example of this. That Huracan picture that was at McDonald's. I don't know why I really wanted to like I wanted to give it almost like a matrixy vibe. I just been playing around with this a lot more lately and changing the styles up, introduced some green into the shadows, and I was actually really happy with how it turned out. Here, this little eye, you can press and hold to turn it off, and you'll see the difference between no greens. It's just like that's obviously really cool too, right? But I just wanted to get creative and change it up. So I put a little bit of green in there, and it gives it a like slightly, right? Like you see how slightly off center that is. Whereas if I bring it up here, like it's going to bring a lot of greens in and be over the top. We don't need that. But then again, it works, right? Like there's varying degrees of it, and that's where your creative style really comes in, and you can get as weird as you want with it. So that's just an example of that. We'll go back to the other image and I'll show you a couple other things. Awesome. So now you know what that does. So detail, this is the AI noise reduction. So I'm not going to click it because it's very taxing on your computer, and I have my computer's not that fast. So if I click that, it's going to load for the next 10 minutes. But if you click that, if you have a really noisy image, I can add an example in of a noisy picture right here. Yeah, so if you got a noisy image, click AI denoise, let it do its thing. But for the most part, you shouldn't really need it unless it's like a night shoot and it's super noisy. But I would just use the manual denoise or the manual noise reduction, bring up the luminance a bit, and it'll take a lot of the noise out of the shadows. And then you can sharpen it up with this sharpening. So you go sharpening and amount and bring that up. Now, this here, it just, don't worry about chromatic aberration. That's nothing. I mean, it's something just not relevant for me teaching you how to do this. Profile corrections, it will take the lens. You'll see here it's a little more rounded. If I click this, it's going to flatten the image out a bit. So basically, when you shoot a photo, depending on your lens, it will slightly distort the image based on your lens. So this basically just flattens it out a little bit. I actually don't mind it when it's not. Like I don't usually do this because it just adds a little bit more depth to the photo in my opinion. But you know, here, if you click on it, it tells me I got a Sony E mount 24-70, 2.8, which clearly I do. So it just talks to the camera or the computer. Transform, you don't really need to worry about transform that much. It, it just like distorts the image. You can rotate it, like does weird stuff like this. You don't really need to worry too much about it. I believe the last section, so you got effects, which is vignetting. So if you bring this up, it's going to add like a white corner to the image, and if you bring this down, it's going to be black. So it can be really cool based on creative style, whatever you want to do here. And so that's I don't really ever do a lot of vignetting, but you can if you want. Now you know it's there, and then you can add grain, which is a weird thing. It's not my style, like sharper images. And then don't worry about calibration. There's so many other spots you can adjust the hue and saturation of the primary colors. Just don't worry about that. So I would say start with the basics, get good at these, understand what they do. Don't worry too much about tone curve. I wouldn't say you need to really master that. You really need to master the basics here. And then the color mixer and color grading are the two things that I would say work your way into next and get good at. Masks are a whole nother ball game when it comes to this stuff. But now you know how to use the basics and you know how everything works in Lightroom.